Welcome to tonight's dark journey into the shadows of history. In Louisiana, 1849, whispers spread of a young slave girl whose beauty hid something far more terrifying, a trail of death that would eventually be linked to 22 women. This is not just a story meant to shock you, it's a mystery rebuilt from court whispers, forgotten records, and fragments history tried to bury. As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories researched with real historical effort and true data digging, subscribe now, because every story here takes hours of deep investigation before it reaches your ears. Louisiana in 1849 was a land wrapped in heat, fear, and unspoken rules. Plantations stretched endlessly, and beneath their beauty lived a society built on silence. People learned quickly what could be said aloud, and what must never be questioned. Life for the enslaved was controlled down to every breath, and life for the free was haunted by the fear of losing power. In such a world, truth often died before it was ever spoken. The year itself was tense. Diseases spread easily through towns and plantations, and death was common enough that people rarely looked twice at a body. When someone fell ill suddenly or disappeared, it was blamed on fever, bad luck, or God's will. This constant presence of death created perfect cover for darker acts, allowing evil to hide in plain sight without raising alarms. Nightfall in Louisiana carried a different kind of terror. Swamps breathed strange sounds, and candlelight revealed only fragments of faces and intentions. Rumors traveled faster than facts, but they were shared in whispers, never loudly. To accuse the wrong person, especially within the rigid system of slavery, could mean punishment, exile, or worse. Fear kept mouths shut and eyes turned away. Plantation society depended on obedience and appearances. Owners focused on profit and reputation, not mysteries among the enslaved. Enslaved women were seen as powerless, harmless, and invisible, stripped of individuality. This dangerous assumption blinded everyone. Evil, when wrapped in chains and prejudice, became something people believed could not exist. Law and justice were uneven forces. Crimes against enslaved people were ignored, while accusations involving them were rushed or buried depending on who held power. Investigations were shallow, often ending the moment a convenient explanation appeared. No one wanted disorder. No one wanted scandal, and certainly no one wanted to admit that a monster could rise from within their own system. Within this environment, fear did not scream, it breathed quietly. Women sensed it in uneasy glances, in sudden illnesses, in disappearances no one explained. But sensing danger and proving it were two very different things. Without voices, without protection, fear became a private burden carried alone. This was Louisiana in 1849, a place where silence protected cruelty, where death blended into daily life, and where the most terrifying truth of all was not the violence itself, but how easily it could remain unseen. Slavery in 1849, Louisiana was not just a system of forced labor, it was a structure of absolute control. Power rested entirely in the hands of those who owned land and people, while everyone else existed beneath them in carefully enforced silence. This imbalance created a world where suffering was expected, questions were discouraged, and authority was rarely challenged, no matter how strange or disturbing events became. Within this system, secrecy was survival. Enslaved people learned quickly that speaking too much could lead to punishment or death. Plantation owners, on the other hand, hid anything that might threaten their reputation or economic stability. If something went wrong, it was buried, explained away, or blamed on the enslaved themselves. Truth became flexible, shaped by whoever held power at the moment. Women were especially vulnerable. Enslaved women lived under constant observation, yet paradoxically were never truly seen as individuals. Their pain, fear, and even their deaths were considered insignificant. When women began to fall ill or disappear, it barely registered as something worth investigating. The system had already decided whose lives mattered. Power also distorted justice. Accusations moved in only one direction, from the top down. The idea that an enslaved girl could manipulate events, deceive others, or commit calculated violence was unthinkable to those in control. This arrogance created a dangerous blind spot, allowing actions to go unnoticed simply because they did not fit accepted beliefs. Plantations functioned like closed worlds. Outsiders rarely interfered, and internal matters stayed internal. Rumors might circulate among the enslaved, but they rarely crossed the invisible line into official concern. Even when fear spread quietly, it had nowhere to go. There was no authority willing to listen. Religion and social norms reinforced this silence. Suffering was often framed as fate or divine punishment, not something to be questioned. People were encouraged to endure rather than confront. In this way, cruelty was normalized, and responsibility dissolved into ritual and routine. This deadly mix of power and secrecy created the perfect environment for something monstrous to grow. When no one is allowed to speak, and no one wants to see, evil doesn't need to hide. It simply exists, unchecked, protected by the very system meant to maintain order. She did not stand out in the way danger usually does. To most eyes, she was ordinary, quiet, young, and unremarkable within a system that refused to see enslaved people as individuals. She moved through daily routines without drawing attention, blending into the background of plantation life. That invisibility would become her greatest shield. People underestimated her because they believed they understood her place in the world. An enslaved girl was assumed to be weak, fearful, and incapable of independent thought. No one imagined ambition, intelligence, or calculation behind her eyes. This assumption allowed her to observe freely, to listen without suspicion, and to learn the habits and weaknesses of those around her. She learned quickly how people behaved when they felt safe. She noticed who trusted easily, who spoke carelessly, and who never questioned a familiar face. While others saw her as harmless, she absorbed details, illnesses, rivalries, routines, pieces of information that would later become tools. Underestimation gave her access no force ever could. Her silence was intentional. Speaking less made her presence forgettable. When trouble arose, no one recalled seeing her nearby. When deaths occurred, no one connected them to a girl who barely seemed to exist. In a society obsessed with control, she mastered the art of appearing controlled. There were moments, subtle and fleeting, when something about her unsettled people. A lingering stare, a calmness in situations where fear was expected, but such impressions were dismissed almost instantly. Questioning her would have meant questioning the system itself, and that was something no one was prepared to do. Those closest to her never imagined she could be dangerous. Trust formed naturally, carelessly. She was allowed near kitchens, sickbeds, and private spaces because she was seen as incapable of harm. Each act of trust tightened the circle of protection around her. In a world built on prejudice, she weaponized belief. The greatest mistake made by those around her was not cruelty alone, but certainty. The certainty that someone like her could never become something far more terrifying than they were willing to imagine. Her appearance became the mask no one questioned. In a society obsessed with surface impressions, beauty disarmed suspicion before it could even form. Soft features, a calm expression, and a composed manner made people feel at ease around her. What they saw reassured them. What they didn't see was the danger beneath. Beauty opened doors that would have otherwise remained closed. People lowered their guard, offering kindness they might not have shown to someone else. Conversations became warmer, trust came quicker, and access followed naturally. In a world where fear ruled so many interactions, comfort was powerful, and she knew exactly how to create it. She learned how to adjust herself to the expectations of others. When obedience was expected, she appeared gentle and compliant. When sympathy was useful, she seemed vulnerable. Every expression, every gesture, was carefully shaped to match what the observer wanted to see. This adaptability made her presence feel safe, even welcome. Her victims often had no reason to fear her. Standing near them, she looked like someone who needed protection, rather than someone who posed a threat. This illusion allowed her to stay close enough to observe weaknesses, routines, and moments of isolation. By the time doubt appeared, it was already too late. Society reinforced this deception. The belief that beauty and danger could not coexist blinded people completely. Violence was expected to come from anger, strength, or madness, not from a calm face and quiet voice. That belief protected her better than any alibi ever could. Even rumors failed to attach themselves to her. When deaths were discussed, attention drifted elsewhere, toward illness, jealousy, or imagined outsiders. Her appearance placed her outside the mental picture of a killer. She existed beyond suspicion, hidden by assumptions rather than shadows. In the end, beauty was not just an advantage, it was a weapon. It allowed her to move unseen, to approach without resistance, and to strike without warning. What made her truly terrifying was not how she looked, but how deeply people trusted what they saw. The first death did not arrive with screams or obvious violence. It came quietly, almost politely, slipping into the routine of daily life. A woman fell ill suddenly, her strength draining faster than anyone expected. By the time concern replaced routine, it was already too late. People blamed the heat, the water, or the sicknesses that were common in Louisiana at the time. Sudden deaths were not unusual, especially among women whose health was already strained by labor and stress. No one searched for deeper meaning because nothing about the death seemed out of place. There were small details that felt wrong, but they were easy to ignore. The illness progressed too quickly. The symptoms didn't match what others were experiencing. Still, without a reason to question, those details faded into the background of grief and acceptance. The woman had been healthy just days before. She had spoken of plans, of chores to finish, of tomorrow. Her sudden absence left a quiet gap, but gaps were common in a world where lives were easily lost and rarely recorded. Those closest to her felt an unease they couldn't explain. Something about the timing, the speed, the silence, it lingered in their minds, but unease without proof had no power. Fear without language stayed locked inside. No investigation followed. There were no questions asked beyond the surface. The body was buried, the routine resumed, and life moved forward exactly as it always had. That normality was the most chilling part. What no one realized was that this death was not an accident or fate. It was a test. A first step taken carefully, quietly, to see how easily a life could be erased without anyone looking back. As more women died, a pattern slowly began to form, though at first it was visible only to those living closest to the fear. Each victim seemed different in age and background, yet they shared subtle connections that were easy to dismiss. They lived or worked within the same circles, crossed the same paths, and trusted the same familiar faces. These women often fell ill shortly after moments of closeness. A shared meal, time spent together, a small act of care, things meant to bring comfort, became the last ordinary memories attached to them. No one thought to question these moments because they appeared harmless, even kind. Whispers began among the enslaved long before any concern reached those in power. People noticed who had been present before the sickness began, who had visited, who had helped. But whispers were dangerous, and speaking openly risked punishment. Fear kept these observations buried. The women who died also shared vulnerability. Some were isolated, others struggling, and many lacked anyone who could speak loudly on their behalf. Their lives existed on the margins, making their deaths easier to overlook and quicker to forget. To outsiders, the deaths appeared random. But to those watching closely, the randomness felt staged. The timing was too precise, the progression too similar. Still, without authority or evidence, suspicion remained trapped in silence. Each death reinforced the safety of the one responsible. With every life taken and ignored, confidence grew. The lack of consequences became proof that the pattern would never be seen, let alone stopped. What made this series of deaths truly terrifying was not just the number, but the realization that they were connected at all, linked by trust, proximity, and a system that refused to protect the women it was losing. No one ever agreed on how the women died, and that uncertainty became the perfect hiding place. Some showed signs of sickness that resembled poisoning, violent stomach pain, weakness, and a rapid decline that made recovery impossible. Others bore marks that could have been dismissed as accidents or self-inflicted injuries. The lack of consistency confused anyone who bothered to notice. Poisons were common in 1849, stored openly for rats, insects, and crops. In small amounts, they were nearly impossible to trace, especially without proper medical knowledge. A pinch mixed into food or drink could look like illness rather than murder. Doctors, when called at all, blamed contaminated water or natural causes. Blades told a different story. A few deaths carried signs of sharp force, cuts that were explained away as work injuries or moments of panic. Women worked with knives daily, and wounds were not unusual. When blood was found, it was easier to assume an accident than to imagine intent. The most disturbing possibility was that some deaths were neither poison nor blade alone. A combination of methods would explain why no single explanation fit all cases. It also suggested planning, adaptability, and a willingness to change tactics to avoid suspicion. Coincidence became the official answer. When deaths could not be neatly explained, they were labeled unfortunate timing or bad luck. Each explanation stood alone, never connected to the last. This separation kept anyone from seeing the full picture. Even those who sensed murder couldn't prove it. There were no autopsies, no reliable tests, and no interest in investigating the deaths of women society already considered expendable. Uncertainty wasn't questioned, it was accepted. In the end, the method mattered less than the result. Whether poison, blade, or something else entirely, the true weapon was confusion. And as long as confusion ruled, the killer remained invisible, protected by doubt itself. Rumors did not travel openly on the plantations, they crept. They passed from mouth to ear in kitchens, fields, and dark corners where voices dropped low. Enslaved workers spoke in fragments, careful never to say too much at once. Everyone understood that the wrong words, spoken to the wrong person, could bring punishment instead of protection. The rumors were never clear enough to sound like accusations. They were questions instead. Why did sickness follow certain visits? Why did the same face appear near so many tragedies? These thoughts stayed unfinished, hanging in the air without names attached, because naming danger made it real and dangerous to the speaker. At night, fear grew stronger. Women slept lightly, listening to every sound. Some avoided shared meals, others refused help when they were ill. But these small acts of self-protection were quiet rebellions, not solutions. Fear spread faster than certainty, and certainty was what no one could afford. Plantation owners heard fragments of these whispers, but dismissed them as superstition or gossip. To them, rumors among the enslaved were noise, not warnings. Admitting there was truth in them would mean admitting loss of control, and that was unacceptable. Among the enslaved, belief and doubt fought each other constantly. Some thought the deaths were cursed. Others believed a spirit walked among them. A few sensed something far more human and far more terrifying, but without proof, their fear remained internal. As the rumors spread, so did isolation. Trust weakened. People watched one another more closely, yet still avoided direct confrontation. Everyone felt the presence of something wrong, but no one could point to it without risking everything. In the end, the rumors changed nothing except the atmosphere. They filled the plantations with unease, thick and suffocating. And while fear whispered in every corner, the one responsible continued to move freely, untouched by the very voices that sensed the truth. No one suspected her because the idea itself felt impossible. An enslaved girl was seen as someone acted upon, never someone who acted with intention. Violence, in the minds of those in power, came from men, from rebellion, or from outsiders, not from a quiet girl bound by chains and rules. Her position placed her beneath notice. People looked past her, not at her. When something went wrong, attention moved upward or outward, never downward. Blame searched for authority, not invisibility. That blind direction protected her more effectively than silence ever could. She fit perfectly into expectations. She worked when told, spoke when spoken to, and showed no outward defiance. Nothing about her behavior suggested danger. In a society obsessed with control, obedience was mistaken for harmlessness. Even when patterns began to emerge, they clashed with deeply held beliefs. To connect the deaths to her would have meant accepting that the system itself had failed, that it had created something it could not control. That thought was easier to reject than investigate. Gender played its role as well. Women were not viewed as capable of calculated violence, especially not violence spread across time. Emotion, hysteria, or weakness were the traits assigned to them, not patience, planning, or cruelty. Suspicion also required courage. To accuse her would have meant standing alone against assumptions, risking punishment, ridicule, or worse. Without absolute proof, doubt was safer than truth. So she remained beyond suspicion, not because there were no signs, but because no one was willing or able to see them. And in that refusal to imagine the unthinkable, she continued, hidden not by darkness, but by belief itself. The number did not emerge all at once. It surfaced slowly, pieced together from memory, rumor, and records that were never meant to align. 1 death was forgettable. 5 were tragic. 10 felt unsettling. But when the count reached 22, it crossed into something undeniable, something no longer explainable by chance. Those who finally noticed the number felt a quiet shock rather than outrage. 22 women, gone within a limited span of time, all connected by proximity and familiarity. Even in a place where death was common, this was excessive. It hinted at intention, repetition, and control. Investigators, few and reluctant, did not uncover the number through careful work. They stumbled into it. Names repeated. Locations overlapped. Stories echoed one another. The realization came not from proof, but from accumulation. Too many similarities stacked too neatly to ignore. Still, the number frightened more than it motivated. To acknowledge 22 victims meant acknowledging a serial presence, something far more disturbing than isolated tragedy. It meant admitting that the system had failed repeatedly, publicly, and fatally. Some records were altered. Others vanished. Deaths were reclassified, dates blurred, causes simplified. Reducing the count reduced responsibility. The fewer the numbers, the easier it was to sleep at night. Among those who knew, the number became unspoken truth. It circulated in low voices, passed like a warning rather than a fact. Saying it aloud felt dangerous, as if the number itself carried consequences. 22 was not just a count of the dead. It was a measure of how long violence could persist when no one wanted to look closely. And once the number existed, even briefly, it could never truly be erased. The truth never disappeared. It was deliberately buried. What threatened order, reputation, or authority was quietly removed from official memory. Records were altered, stories shortened, and uncomfortable details left out entirely. History was rewritten not with lies, but with omissions. The legal system played its part. Investigations that might have revealed connections were halted early or never begun. Questions stopped at convenient answers. Without trials, testimonies, or formal accusations, there was nothing solid for the truth to stand on. Those with power had reasons to erase it. Acknowledging what happened would have meant admitting that control was an illusion that the system designed to dominate had produced. Something it could not contain. Silence was easier than accountability. For the enslaved, truth had no safe place to live. They carried it in memory, not paper. But memory fades, especially when fear forces it underground. Over time, witnesses were sold, moved or died, taking their knowledge with them. Even later historians struggled. Fragmented documents, conflicting accounts, and deliberate gaps made reconstruction nearly impossible. What survived felt incomplete, like a story missing its most important pages. What remained was a shadow version of events, enough to unsettle, not enough to convict. The truth existed between lines, in patterns rather than statements, in what was avoided rather than what was written. In the end, the greatest crime was not only the deaths themselves, but how easily the truth was stripped of its voice. History did not forget by accident, it was taught to look away. What survived was not a name carved into stone, but a warning carried in fragments. The story refused to stay buried completely, lingering in whispers passed down through generations. Even without full records, the unease remained, like a scar that never healed. History tried to smooth over the edges, turning real fear into vague folklore. Details blurred, motives vanished, and the victims became numbers or shadows. This transformation made the story easier to ignore, but it also made it more haunting. The legacy left behind was one of silence rather than justice. No closure followed the deaths, no reckoning to restore balance. What endured instead was the knowledge that something terrible had happened, and that it had been allowed to happen. For those who later uncovered traces of the story, the gaps spoke louder than the facts. Missing documents, altered accounts, and unexplained absences revealed intent. Erasure itself became evidence of wrongdoing. The women who died were denied remembrance, but their absence shaped everything that followed. Each missing life represented a failure, not just of individuals, but of an entire system that chose order over humanity. This story lingers because it challenges comfort. It reminds us that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it survives by being ignored, protected by prejudice and fear. And that is the legacy history tried to erase, not just the identity of a killer, but the reminder that when voices are silenced, darkness doesn't need to hide. It simply waits.